My name is Harvey Edwards. I live here in Selinsgrove. I am 64 years old. I
University. Tell us a
currently
little bit about
teach at Susquehanna University in the English department after 29 years at Selinsgrove High School and 5 years at what now is Midwest School District. Graduated from Bucknell University. That's how I found this area. I was recruited to play basketball and left briefly after I graduated, moved out to the West Coast, San Francisco Bay Area. And then my now wife and I decided to move back and we got married in this area and we've been here ever since 30 plus years.
So you left. What was the reason for coming back? Was it work, or did you kind of miss the place and enjoy living there?
It was a little bit of both. Um, Family is in the East Coast, mostly in New York. So California was just too far away. We didn't get many people visiting us as much as we offered. And we also thought, as both of us are educators, San Francisco Bay Area, very expensive. So we wanted to move back east, not necessarily back to New York, but to some modest place where the quality of life would be good and the cost of living would be reasonable. And this area suits that perfectly, aside from also being very beautiful.
And your first job was at West Snyder. Right?
My first job actually was at Cumberland Valley High School. I was a long-term sub there for 5 months. So my wife and I, she worked at Camp Hill at the time. So we drove, I would drop her at Holy Spirit Hospital and then drive to Mechanicsburg, teach, come back, pick her up, and go home. And that was our commute from Mount Pleasant Mills. And then we moved into Selinsgrove, and she remained down in the Harrisburg area. And I got a job at West Snyder High School. After substituting in pretty much every school district, I got hired at West Snyder High School, taught there for 5 years, and then a position opened in Selinsgrove, and I had been living in Selinsgrove, and so that made it more convenient.
What year did you get hired at West Snyder?
I was hired in 83, I believe.
Were you the school's only teacher of color?
Yes, yes.
Do you have any idea if you were the school's first? I think that's a possibility.
I think maybe first and only.
Yeah. So tell me about being, the only teacher of color in that school. What was that experience like? Were people pretty readily accepting of you, or did you find it hard to adjust?
There are so many ways to discuss that. I think the students at first were shocked because I don't think that many of them had come in contact with a person of color. The faculty as well, but you saw it more with the students. In fact, I'll never forget one little girl, 8th grader, but I'm considering her small because she's in 8th grade. Because West Snyder was junior, senior high school. And I don't think it was because of the color of my skin, but she was just trying to sort of be tough. And she said, the last teacher we had, we made her cry. And I just sort of looked at her firmly and I said, in this situation, who do you think would be crying? And she kind of looked at me and her eyes got big. I said, so that's not going to happen here. And then there was an incident that parallels what was on the front page of the paper today, so to speak, that incident with the misspelling of White Lives Matter, which on the one hand you have to laugh at, and on the other hand you just wonder how, why. But a tradition around the Halloween time was soaping the windows in the building. And so I came in one morning and there was something written on my window. And I went and got the principal and I said, you need to see this. And he came down to my room and he looked in and he said, that will be off immediately. And he stormed away, justifiably upset. And standing there by myself, I looked at the window and read Niger, Niger. I said, they called me a river. they called me a country. I got to stay here at least until they can spell correctly. And I was there for 5 years.
Did you have any incidents after that?
I really did not.
How did you handle it then? From like, did you address it your students at the time? Or?
I addressed anything that came up in my classroom. I tried to deal with it in my classroom. It largely worked out. I left on wonderful terms. In fact, my exit interview, our conversation, the principal and I had a conversation. He said, I'm surprised that you stayed those 5 years. And I think he might have been referencing back to that word that was written on my window. And I said, I learned a tremendous amount. I enjoyed my time teaching here, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. And he said, yeah, we'd like to keep you. I said, yes, but I've been waiting for a position to open at Selinsgrove. That's where I live. And so we left on extremely good terms.
Did you find yourself over the course of your career at Selinsgrove having conversations about race and engaging students on the differences in cultures and similarities?
Oh, absolutely, all the time. In fact, I started a group called the Tolerance Troupe, an acting troupe. We ran for 20 years, and we did skits on just about every kind of ism or phobia that you could think of. And the idea was to do a skit, have the students stay in character, and I facilitate the dialogue between the audience and the students. And to commend the students, it was an award-winning acting group. We traveled all over the state performing for all kinds of audiences, from preschool to senior citizens, and we were well received.
I'm thinking, and I may be off, but I'm imagining there could be moments of tension when you're challenging stereotypes that could be pretty deeply rooted in some of these students, personalities, character, however you describe it. So can you think of like one or two moments that really stand out where you and your group of students really challenged a stereotype and maybe got through to someone or didn't?
Well, I think one of the surprising elements to me, we would speak directly to the students, and faculty and staff would be in the assembly program as well. And if it were on race, let's say, or gender issues or whatever, I would use some of the derogatory terms and ask the students if they heard them in their school. And there were countless times where I would say, have you heard the word nigger or faggot in your school? And the students would raise their hands to the chagrin of the teachers. And it always surprised me that the teachers were startled by this, because we know it's everywhere. And it's just the amount of how do you deal with it, and how many kids are using this. Are there cases of selective hearing where it's always easier to take the path of least resistance? So I hear something that is bullying or racist or homophobic, and if I ignore it, then I can get away without having to deal with it. And so it always surprised me when faculty and staff that were in on these performances would seem shocked that their students would readily raise their hands. And so in those instances, I would go to one of those students who had a hand raised, and I would say, okay, so you heard that term. What did you do? And many times students would say nothing. And then that's when I would offer options of not being a passive spectator, but of maybe reaching out to that person one-on-one and saying, you call that person this name, I have that person in my class, the person's a decent individual, you need to realize you don't know that person. You're calling this person that simply because you're seeing that person's skin color or how that person might have a certain affectation or what have you. And so the tolerance troop was always designed at trying to give the students strategies for how to deal with those events the next time they occurred.
So let's say from '83 to 2016, you were in public education in the Valley here.
Correct.
You taught two generations of students, roughly. Is it two, three?
Well, this was my defining line for retiring. There were many times where students would say, "You had my mom, you had my dad." That was cool. I did not want to be around when a student came to me and said, "You had my grandmother, you had my grandfather." So that was my motivation for retiring in 2016 because it was coming close to that. And I did not want to hear those words.
Did you notice a shift at all over the course of those generations as far as maybe the comfort of discussing discrimination and stereotypes and racism and like the active expression of racist ideologies?
You know, I think we are in a moment where this is going to be lasting and meaningful. So I would say to you, um, I have noticed students being more accepting, and
And you mean
and
now
be
toward the tail end of your
yes,
career?
and also being willing to speak um, about topics that they maybe would not have spoke about before.
Shifting a little bit, some people have watched the full video, some people have not. Did you watch the full video of George Floyd's murder?
Yes, yes.
Can you take me into your
Several.
mindset when you were watching it?
What stunned me, and I've said this to people time and time again, what stunned me was the police officer had his hands in his pocket, which says to you, if you feel threatened, you would have your hands out, your fists, um, something. He was so casual and nonchalant that it said to me, his body language, his demeanor, and everything said to me, this person's life does not matter. He was unconcerned about what he was doing. And even when his body was motionless, he was still on his neck. Um, it's a watershed moment. And that's why we find ourselves where we are today with so many significant things happening in our country right now with regards to people of color. I think any of the issues that to some degree have divided us, people are starting to come together. And I think it's going to be more than just a few months. I think the change is here to stay.
I do forget the age that you told me, but you must have been a young boy in 1968, right?
1968, I was 12 years old.
Okay, so you probably have vivid memories of that period of time compared to now. Do you draw any similarities and any differences?
You know, I think social media gets a bad rap in many ways, but I think right now, used effectively, it has really helped to organize much more. You can reach so many more people, and you can look at that by evidence of the protests, not just in this country and the size, but around the world. So I think that that is a tremendous difference because uh, seeing those protests in places like Japan, where the Japanese people are very conservative, and I've been to Japan, so I'm not just speaking, you know, second-handedly. I've been to Japan. I've been to Australia. I've been to New Zealand, and these places are protesting, and I'm going. This never would have been possible in 1968 because not as many people would have seen what we all saw. That's just the reality now, and it still surprises me, as in the case recently with the police officer in New York who had a young black man in a chokehold. It it still surprises me that with all the smartphones and technology, things being recorded all the time, that some people, police officers or others, are not more conscious of what they're doing. It really surprises me. So, but I really think this is different. The movement, the groundswell of people who want to see change. It's different because there are so many more people who are allied with people of color this time.
Have you had any experiences, maybe as a young man or an adult, negative experiences with police that you believe are rooted on the color?
Oh yes, oh yes. Um, Twice in my life, I've had guns pointed at me. In both cases, policemen were on the other side of that gun. Um, the first time my nephew and I were coming back from Washington, D.C., we got off the bus and at the Port Authority, took the train into Brooklyn, and we had suitcases. We were dressed very nicely. It was Easter, and
Remember about what year it would have
this would have been, I was probably 16, 17, and we were walking under an overpass, and I was drinking a soda. There wasn't a garbage can or anything around, so I bent down and placed it near the curb by a car. Now this is back in the 60s, when if you had an alarm on your car, it was on the outside by the front tire, and you needed a key to arm it and disarm it. So I put the bottle down, and my nephew and I are walking, and there's a guy walking at us, directly at us, but he's got a hood on his jacket, and his head is down, and we, couldn't see him and whatever. We didn't know whether he was black or white or whatever. And then he got to within about 6 or 8 feet of us, threw back his hood, pulled out a gun, and said, "Freeze." This van comes screaming down the street along with a taxi cab, and here there was a stakeout because cars had been stolen underneath this overpass. And he is holding a gun. These police officers come out of these other cars and everything else, and they asked, "What did you do over there by that car?" I said, "I put a bottle down over there because there wasn't a garbage can around." He went and looked over, and he said, "Okay, where you guys coming?" And we said, "We just got off the train from a bus ride from Washington, D.C. We've got tickets here that we can show you and everything else."
And these questions are being asked while a handgun.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. And so all of a sudden, they're like, "You blew our steak out." No apology, nothing. You blew our steak out. They thought that we were trying to jack that car. And we're left there to say, "Sorry, not us. We don't steal cars." The second time, my sister, who is many years my senior, worked in the post office in Manhattan, and she would come home at night. So my nephew and I would go to pick her up and escort her from the train station. And this night we happened to have a boom box, and we walked to the train station, and there was a telephone booth just a little distance from the kiosk where the tokens were being sold. So we put the boom box on top of the telephone and turned it up, and we had this little music studio. We're just jamming away and whatever. And we look up, and there's a police officer running down the steps with his hand on his gun, and we kind of look at him and laugh because it looks like he's going to trip and fall and hurt himself. So we're, still listening to the music and everything else and whatever. We're literally in this telephone booth. He rolls up on us, pulls out his gun, and says, "Freeze." And we're going, "Is this it's almost like a television episode." We're going, what are you talking about? Almost at that moment, my sister gets off the escalator, and she does the classic double take. She looks to her right, and then looks again and realizes this police officer has a gun on both of us. And she's yelling, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And the guy in the kiosk is saying, "Hey, they're here whenever they need to pick this young woman up." Da, 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 da. And so my sister comes over and says, "What are you doing?" And the officer says, the what business was it? The Red Cross had been robbed. There was this big Red Cross building, and it housed other businesses as well. Someone had robbed the building, and she asked, "Do you have a description of who robbed the building?" And he said no. And she then went off on him. So you assume it's these two young black boys listening to this music, and we're thinking, boy, we would have been pretty smart thieves to steal that money, come down here and act like nothing happened. We're just listening to music. So those are two instances where I had police hold guns on me in Brooklyn.
I think it's important to know, how did that inform your perception of police, and kind of on a broader scale, for the black community, maybe the white community doesn't really understand it. So how do these interactions inform your future interactions and your thoughts about police?
Um, I grew up having had the talk, as we call it, and so police were always. I don't want any. I don't want any part. I'm not necessarily looking at them as peace officers to solve my problems or whatever. It's avoidance. That was basically my attitude towards the police. I do have to give one other account, and I share these stories in my classes with my students. My mother had diabetes. She had been rushed to the hospital, and my niece called me to say, "You should get here." So, needless to say, I got on Route 80 in pretty new Honda Civic that my wife and I had just purchased. I mean, we're talking months old. And I get to Brooklyn rather quickly to pick up my niece to go to visiting hours. And visiting hours were going to end at something like 8 o'clock. So you had to be in the hospital before 8, or else they wouldn't let you up. So en route from picking up my niece, I had to go past the police station, the 84th precinct. And we drive by, and all of a sudden, the lights out. I get pulled over, and I say, "Officer, what's the issue?" So there's a brand new car, Pennsylvania plates. He says, "You have a taillight out." I said, This is a brand new car." He said, "You have a taillight out. That's why I pulled you over. License and registration." So I give him my license and registration, and I'm fuming. I'm upset, and my niece is trying to keep me settled, and I'm going, "This is ridiculous. This is a brand new car. I can't believe he's saying this. He just wants to run my information because he thinks the car is stolen." So I committed the cardinal sin. I got out of the car, and I went back towards the police car, pointing my finger, yelling and screaming and everything. And he got on his microphone and said, "Get back in the car, get back in the car." And I was still yelling and screaming at him. I got back into the car. And he said, "Okay, Mr. Edwards, you have this ticket. When you get that taillight replaced, just send the receipt in, and this ticket will be expunged," whatever, and so on and so forth. And I was still furious. I'm saying, I'm probably going to miss visiting hours with my mother. I drove here from Pennsylvania and whatever, and so on and so forth. And he said, "Mr. Edwards, excuse me, follow me." He turned on the siren, and we blew through red lights for him to get me to the hospital before visiting hours were over. I wouldn't say that's a total counterbalance of how I feel towards the police. I try to look at every individual as an individual. And what matters most is how they treat me and how they treat other people. And that's where respect should emanate from. And so my attitude towards the police, um, I have no qualms with the police. I have good relationship with the police officers in Selinsgrove. I know Chief Garlock, my neighbor, is former Officer Wolfberg. So I look at the police individual by individual. I don't throw a blanket over police as you know the men in blue who might be coming after you. Uh, I deal with the police on an individual basis.
What what would you teach people about the concept of systemic racism and how maybe you've encountered some of that through your own experience?
The two courses that I teach here, I go into quite a bit through the literature that I teach to show the students the systemic racism. I teach in my writing and thinking course a book called The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, which is about a Baltimore woman who was responsible for the first immortal cells that allowed for much of the experimentation that has given us life-saving drugs today. And her life was basically ignored because she was a black woman. And when we read that in class, along with Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and they begin to read and see for themselves, it really opens their eyes. And so during this pandemic, I've had many students, especially after the George Floyd incident, I've had many students, my white students here, contact me saying, thank you for educating me ahead of this. Thank you for letting me know before this heinous act of what was out there. And even some high school students have gotten back in touch with me um, based on teaching To Kill a Mockingbird and trying to show them in the appropriate literature for high school how systemic racism works. I think that people need to be educated to the things that they don't necessarily see in front of them. And that would lead me to Bubba Wallace and the Confederate flag, and how this is a flag that an army marched under that wanted to destroy this country, maintain slavery, not about states' rights. That flag represents hatred. And it always surprises me that people in Pennsylvania, the state that was the first state slaves would try to get to for their freedom, it really blows my mind to see that flag and to have people say, I have pride for this flag because it's part of my heritage. You can't pick and choose. So if you're going to embrace that flag, you've got to take all that comes with it. And much more of what comes with that flag is incongruent with the principles of this country. And I think NASCAR, uh, Bubba Wallace, and them pushing his car, the symbolism of that is so important, and symbols really do matter. And you know, I don't think the people who, and I just recently saw bumper stickers and everything else, I don't think that they fully understand the history of this country. Um, Maybe when they're sitting in those history classes, they're not imagining what it really must have been like to have people as slaves, human beings. Um, and that's the issue. Just because we look different, you can't lose sight of the fact that regardless of how we look, Asian, Latino, whatever, we're all human beings. That's it. We're human beings, and if a human being is handsome, wealthy, but treats other individuals like trash, you need to look at that individual and not link the color of his skin or his wealth to it. It's that individual, and that's what I think people are starting to see.
You've been living here for a while now. What have you seen change in this area in the terms of racism, how prevalent it was when you maybe first moved here versus what it is now? Have you seen changes?
I've seen big changes in terms of acceptance in many ways and many forms. Um, I had a wonderful neighbor. She's deceased. Um, Probably 10, 15 years my senior. My sons, I have twin sons, and they're biracial because my wife is Irish and German. That's her background. They called this woman Aunt Edie. And one day we were out at our mailbox, and we had our mailboxes on a Lazy Susie. So we have the four houses. We had four mailboxes, and the mail person could spin them around and put the mail in. And we were out there one day, and we were talking about something, and she was making a comment about something that was hard to perceive. And she said, looking at me, yeah, like a nigger in a coal bin, and froze, turned and walked away. And I went back into my house. And honestly, I was in shock. I didn't know what to say to her. About 10 minutes later, she came, knocked on my door, and she said, I can't believe I said that to you. I grew up with that saying. Never dawned on me that there was anything wrong with it until I said it to you. And so much racial tension, phobic behavior is because people are ignorant in the sense that they have no experience, no knowledge of something different in their world. So here now, this statement meant nothing to her until she said it to a black person. Similar to me growing up in New York and hearing, oh yeah, I Jewed him down, meaning I talked the price down to get it for less. And those kind of phrases, if you are in an environment where that's socially acceptable, you don't notice it until you get out of that environment and someone brings your attention to it. One of the phrases here was when I was teaching in one of the public schools, and I was reading some information, and I said, so how would you describe the t-shirt that this character had on? And one student raised his hand and said, it's a wife beater. And everybody in the classroom, they were cool with that. And I went, what? It's a wife beater. And I went, oh, so this is the shirt that he wears when he beats his wife? And a few people giggled, and a few other people paused and went, huh. I said, it's a tank top. It's a sleeveless t-shirt. And then I reacted and I said, you know what though? Growing up in New York, the name for that shirt was a guinea teeth, the derogatory term for an Italian. And I said, so we all have our pockets of these statements, these blind spots where we don't realize the harm until we're confronted with it. And this is what I mean about the Confederate flag and everything else. Until you have a different perspective, you might think it's fine.
This area's had worldwide. There's been a lot of protests, but this area seems like protests are growing around here. Did you ever think that you would see like this many protests and this sustained around this area?
Mifflinburg.
Yes, certainly not. And you know, I could only imagine if the campus were back, what some of these protests would be like. If students were here, they'd be even larger. So yes, pleasant surprise. And that's why I believe this is a different moment. I really do. There will be lasting change as a result of this.